Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services at MedCommsNetworking.com. So that's information, resources, services, activities for the global MedComms community, by which I am talking people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing. We've got a whole variety of activity going on and resources at MedCommsNetworking.com and some of the associated websites. What we're doing at the moment is running these weekly webinars, which is a great way of involving lots more people from around the world on a whole host of different topics. And today I'm absolutely delighted and quite curious to see what happens. We're going to talk about UX, user experience, which is something I know I can get excited about and other people can get a bit excited about, because we've all had our examples of projects where you think, oh, if I'd only thought of that one a little bit more sensibly through at the beginning, it wouldn't have turned out quite like this. So we're going to have a presentation today from Dan and from Tom from Brandcast. Thank you very much for joining us, guys. We're going to follow the presentation with a Q&A session. Members of the audience, please do join in and offer your observations, comments and questions via the text boxes. So without further ado, Dan and Tom, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourselves and give us your presentation to lead into that Q&A. Thank you very much, guys.
Hi there. So my name is Dan. I'm a director at Brandcast Health. Thanks for joining us. So what I just wanted to do quickly before we dive into the details of the presentation is just give you a little bit of context as to why we wanted to talk about user experience, why we thought it would be useful for everyone. So essentially at Brandcast Health, if you don't know the agency, we are a medical communications and marketing agency, but our main focus is working on digital transformation, digital marketing strategy and digital assets for pharma, biotech and other healthcare companies. So the reason why we thought it would be useful to talk to our MedComms friends about UX and our pharma friends is because it really helped us solve a challenge at our agency, and we thought it would be really useful to tell you why it did and hopefully give you some useful tips, and potentially an area that you might not have known a lot about might help you to learn more about how to deliver great projects or work on great projects. So because most of the work we do is digital, that is the main focus, but UX does apply outside of digital as well. And of course, we have developers and designers and animators and people like that some MedComms agencies might not have. But still, despite that, the majority of the content and tactical comms strategy will traditionally come from our account management teams or our medical content teams, like it does at a lot of MedComms agencies. When you deliver a complex digital asset, like something like a website, which is incredibly important to a company and serves multiple functions and is designed to achieve multiple marketing goals, someone has to deliver like an overall strategic concept for how that asset will work and how it will meet your client's business goals. And for some agencies, the first person to do that might be like the content expert, since they know best how to organize the content in a way that gets all the key messages across to the audience. In other agencies or project teams, it might be a creative director who, will pick it up because they know how best to articulate a brand through a website. And, in other cases, it might be that a strategic team member or a client service team member, or maybe a project manager might be the person who pulls together that overall concept and plan, because they're the ones who know best how to run the project, or maybe best the goals of the clients. So it tends to vary, and we actually found within our agency that this job took a very specific expertise and was performed by different team members, and only some people were really able to do it in a way that took all of the factors into account when pulling together like a brief or essentially a wireframe of, say, a website. And usually, depending on that person's focus, it was skewed towards either a beautiful looking creative design or awesome content architecture, or maybe it was just exactly what the client wanted, which might not have been perfect either. And so we ended up with a bit of imbalance. And what we wanted to do was make this process more structured and make it someone's responsibility to take the client goals, the user goals, and put them together into a plan that demonstrated that the asset, say a website that you create, can meet both of them. And it's quite a challenging thing to do. And at the same time, we also wanted to be able to give the client, and potentially the project team within the agency as well, kind of a visual representation of what the asset will be before you create it. Essentially a provable blueprint that shows how something works, what it's supposed to achieve, and what it will look like without having to design that up and then redesign it or develop something that takes up a lot of resource. So that was the goal we had. And the way we solved it was to integrate UX, user experience, as a specific function and workflow within our project process. And we had great results with that. So it essentially enabled us to solve our problem. And as a MedComms team, we learned a load of things about the value of UX, which we feel is actually really underutilized in this industry. So what we really wanted to do was spread the word. So our internal team has found the topic fascinating and very valuable, and it's been a great experience for us so far. So we wanted to, offer that opportunity to our, wider friends and colleagues in the group. So with that, what I wanted to do is introduce you to Tom. So Tom's a senior UX consultant at Brandcast Health, and what he's going to do is give you an introduction into user experience and why it could be valuable, and then hopefully we'll be able to together dig into the details of how it might fit into your projects or the industry projects in general. So Tom, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. So firstly, to introduce myself, sorry, it's not going through, sorry. Okay, to start off with a technical hitch. To introduce myself, so I'm Thomas Evans, UX consultant at Brandcast Health. I've been doing UX now for about 4 years, originally also doing design and front-end development. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself. So as Dan said, I want to talk to you about UX today, kind of explain what it is, maybe a bit about what it isn't, and then, how it can be useful. So to start off with, I thought a really good example of what can go wrong if UX isn't done properly. So last year, obviously after the coronavirus outbreak, the CDC in America spent $44 million on a vaccine administration management system, or VAMS. And as you can see from some of these kind of quotes, not everything went to plan. So they ended up delivering this system where the people that it was actually for couldn't use it. The people that it was actually for, some of the people didn't have access to a computer or internet, and it ended up doctors would have to use their own time to use the system on behalf of patients. The system was to basically book an appointment for a vaccine, and then manage everything that goes along with that. And as you can see, they only tested it with people with advanced degrees. So the primary audience, especially at the start, that were over 70s, couldn't use the system. It ended up being wasted time of doctors, patients, and all told, quite a big waste of money. Now, let's talk about what UX is. So UX is obviously short for user experience. So this is basically what encompasses all aspects of an end user's interaction with a company, its services, and its products. So a really good example is if you take your phone. If you have an iPhone, the experience, the UX is not just how that phone works. It's the experience you had buying it, the experience you had unboxing it, the experience you have using it, but also the experience you have when something goes wrong. Is it easy to find a solution? Is it easy to find someone to talk to about it? All of that is UX. So UX is all about making the overall service or product serve the user's needs efficiently and joyfully. So one of the biggest points that I want to bring up is that just because a company can have a UX designer or a UX consultant, everyone actually has a hand in improving the UX of a product. So anyone that works for or in that company or on that product has a hand in improving the user experience. This is to show that UX is something that should exist and be thought about throughout a whole project process. So right from the start, when you're trying to find out the business goals and the user needs, through to design, development, And then also after a project goes live, the user experience should always be at the forefront of your mind when you go throughout the whole of a project. Another way to look at this is what we call the 5 planes of UX. So I don't know how easy it is to see, but from the bottom, you have the most abstract information and tasks, and at the top, you have the most concrete. So we start with strategy. So at the start of a project, you need to understand the business goals and the user needs. Why does the product need to exist in the first place? Who is it for? And what does it accomplish? Once you have the strategy in place, you start looking at the scope. So this is stuff like what features are needed, what functions are needed, and that answers the question below. So you have a user need, and now we find what function we need to solve that user need. Too often it happens the other way around, where you have a really good idea, but you don't actually have a user, or you don't have a problem that you're trying to solve. So then once you've understood the strategy and the scope, you go to structure. So this is looking at the information architecture, or basically the structure of the app or the website or whatever it may be. So where can people go? What can they achieve once they're in a certain place? What are the possible paths to the user to achieve their goals? And then on top of that, you have the skeleton, where you're looking at wireframing, designing, but also, how the navigation works, what buttons there needs to be and how do the buttons look and that kind of thing. And then finally, you have surface, which is all about the visual design, which is how is everything shown visually and how is the actual value of the product shown visually. So obviously, if you start a project, at the end of the day, there's going to be people that use it. So UX is all about putting those people first. So it's a good idea to start with some questions and go and talk to people. You want to understand, what do those people do? Why does it matter to them? What do they want from the company or the product or the service? How does it fit in with everything else they're currently using? And what are their expectations? Expectations are a big thing, especially digitally, especially now, with everyone using all different services in their own homes. Like it might be Spotify, Netflix, Amazon Prime, whatever it is. People have high expectations. Your service needs to fit the kind of experience that people are already used to. But of course, you also have to think about business goals. The people that are going to be putting the money into it, building it, that kind of thing. So businesses are always either trying to make money or save money, or they could be trying to attract new customers or retain existing customers. But we have to understand what those goals are and why they matter, so that when we're designing something, we always keep that in mind. And UX and UX design and UX research is all about finding basically the sweet spot in the middle of the user needs and the business goals to give value to both of those people. Or another way of looking at it, a bit more in depth, is for a user to want to use a product, they have to perceive value in that product. If they perceive that value and then they use it, it gives value to the business. The business in turn will, because they see more value from people using it, make more improvements, and those improvements will give more value to the user. And then you're creating that kind of value loop, as we call it. So how do we know what problems we need to solve, and why is problem solving the main part of it? So to have a good solution, you need to have a good problem. The key to UX is identifying the right problems to solve. So what matters most to people? What issues have the most impact or the most measurable value? What can we do to address these issues? And also, if you find a problem, you need to first understand if you can actually solve it. So to identify the right problems that you're trying to solve, you need to put that work in at the start, where you're understanding your user and you're understanding the business goals. So just like the CDC example from the start, if they'd actually worked out what the primary audience was going to be, and they'd spent time talking to those people and testing with those people, they would have seen what problems those people have with the system, and they may have actually been able to create a system those people could use. So I've explained what UX is, the parts that kind of make it up. But what did this mean for Brandcast when we introduced it? It meant a fresh approach to UX strategy and research. It meant actually taking the time to understand the users behind our solutions. It was answering the why, who, what, when, where, and how. It was understanding the user, the business, but also the context and the problems that needed to be solved before we started a project. And this has really enhanced and improved our projects. So I didn't want to go into depth about all the different deliverables and things that you can do in UX and kind of show examples, because it would take, I could talk about it for days. So what I thought would be important is to go through the kind of main buckets, as it were, and talk about the kind of things that we do within them. So first of all, as I've mentioned, we really need to start every project with research. So this includes user research, stakeholder research, surveys, workshops, desk research. So that covers, competitive analysis, that sort of thing. Also UX heuristic review. So actually just doing a UX review of a website or an app. And also, of course, looking at the analytics that there might be, see how many people use it, how they're using it, what they're doing, that kind of thing. There's also usability and accessibility. So the difference is usability is all about how easy it is to use a system. Accessibility is how easy it is for everyone to use that system or that product. So that this is looking at people that might have certain disabilities or might have certain, what if we're trying to reach people that have a really bad internet connection in a very remote place? Accessibility covers all of that. So, we do usability reviews, observational testing, accessibility reviews, and of course, consultation. Then comes the UX design. So this is the bit that I think everyone hears about the most. And this is looking at, the structure of a site or an app. This is looking at the user journey mapping. So how someone comes into a website, for example, and all the different ways they can get to their end goal. We have wireframing, interactive prototyping, and of course, for the second time, testing, because testing is very, very important. And then lastly, what I wanted to talk about during this was what I call the feedback loop. So one of the most important things to remember when doing a project is that once you go live, that shouldn't be the end. It's actually an opportunity. You now have people using your product or your app or your website. So what can we do? We can find out what problems they're having with it, what they like about it, what they don't like about it. We can do testing, and we can look at analytics, do more surveys, or whatever it may be, and then we can plan out what the future is. So going back to the value loop, if we now have people using our system and we understand what they like and what they don't like, then we can start putting value back in and giving the end users more value. So yeah, questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, great. Sorry, thanks very much, Tom. Can we lose the slides then, and then we'll just be looking at us sort of thing. But those of you in the audience, that we've got today, you've got a couple of text boxes, you've got your chat box, you've got your Q&A box. So either of those text box works. Come in with comments, observations and questions, and we'll weave that into the discussion. I think I promised not to simply sit here with a whole bunch of anecdotes, but I'm going to start with one anyway. But it might be interesting if anyone in the audience wants to join in with this. We've all got experience of something going wrong. But I think very early on, very early on, when the internet was just starting, as it were, and some of us were around in those days, and I remember my first website that I'd worked on with somebody and was presenting to a client, and I was on the phone to them, and I was saying, "Isn't this great? Isn't this great?" And they just went, "I don't know what you're talking about, Peter. It's rubbish. It's just, it doesn't make any sense." I mean, we're talking about a long time ago, and it took quite a while to work out. There was genuine bafflement at all ends in those days, that what I was looking at on my Mac, on my browser that I was using at the time, wasn't the same as they were looking at on their computer, on their browser, and so on. Okay, so it's sort of staying on, but it happened very early on for me, and it has completely influenced everything that I've done since, I think, because I test everything. I go out and I ask people, can you see this? Can you, to the point that it becomes a bit stupid, actually. But the principle is important. And I think we all need an experience like that to sort of like realize the importance of it, sort of thing. And I think these days, maybe it doesn't happen quite so blatantly as that, but the principle's absolutely there, isn't it? You can do something and be absolutely convinced in your studio or whatever, this is great, but the person you're trying to get to can't actually see it like that. And if you don't ask the question, then you're not going to know. So let's have we've got a couple of questions coming in. Howard's asking, do you have examples of facets you've discussed? So I think what would be nice is having some I think what Howard's saying is, have you got a few case histories, a few examples of successes, things that work particularly well, examples where this sort of approach has worked well. Have you got something that you could just share with us on that front?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of all the different projects that I've worked on throughout the time. I think a good example is I worked on I worked with a company that was basically like a housing association. They had very different parts to the company. One was more like a charity looking after homeless people. One was a traditional housing association. And then they also had a part which was quite corporate, and they had, conference centers and that kind of thing. And they came to the company that I was working for at the time, and they wanted to take they had 4 different websites with all different branding, and they wanted to unify that. And they wanted to also understand why the people that, like the residents they had such a bad opinion on them, but also their systems, their websites. And they wanted to be able to create a system where a resident could log, I need a repair for my door or whatever it may be, and also be able to pay their rent and see how much rent they had left to pay. And the first thing that I did was I actually spent about 5 days calling residents, just to make it clear that those residents were given to me and they knew that, I could call them. It wasn't just like cold calling. And, there was just the emotion and like the power of what they were telling me. These people, they were, some of the people I spoke to were in quite bad positions. And, they were telling me stories where they were really angry about this housing association. And, I left those phone calls, and I had the challenge of having to communicate those people's kind of anger and frustrations to the business, which isn't an easy thing to do. It's not a lovely meeting to go into where you're like, oh, by the way, I spoke to all these people and they hate you. But I think we were able to almost like use UX to explain those frustrations in a way that could actually be turned into, I actually spoke about it in my meeting, into problems to be solved. So one of the things that people hated is that they got very kind of cold forms, cold letters through saying, you owe us this much, when people hadn't actually been given a chance to pay their rent or whatever it was. So we were able to, put a lot of that kind of frustration and that anger into the system, and present the this is how much you owe in a way that was the end user was happy to see. So it was all about, we were able to approach that in a way that we understood where they were coming from, but we would have only able to do that because we spoke to those people. I spoke to so many people in the housing association, they'd never spoken to their tenants before, other than just through these letters that they'd send through a door. So that was just a really good example to me of like the power of actually just taking the time to speak to the people. I know that's a really long answer, but yeah.
No, but it's sort of, I mean, my part of my argument is that a lot of this conversation can be wrapped up in complicated solutions and all that, which might be appropriate, but actually it starts with that simple question, and it's a bit like my original example. If I had just asked a slightly different question of the guy that I was trying to present this thing to, what browser have you got or something, you'd have a different experience, sort of thing. But if you don't ask the people, you don't know what the problem is. And if you can build that in at the beginning and develop around that, that's great. And we've got to remember there's all these different, and we are talking digital here, but you're also talking about the wider experience, but let's stick with the digital, different devices, different everything really. And you want someone to see the same thing or get the same message or get the same answer using an iPhone, using a computer, using an iPad, whatever. Someone like Jonathan, I think it was talking about, the problem is that there's a tendency, I think he's talking about the tendency to say, let's just use the new whizzy, the latest technology or something, and forget the fact that lots of other people haven't got it. What Jonathan ends up asking is, what do you find to be the biggest barrier to obtaining UX buy-in? And I think this is picked up by a couple of people with their questions. It's like, this is all great stuff, but do the clients, do the developers, does everybody really buy into this? And is the funding then made available in order to resource what could turn into a bigger project than simply a phone call? Dan, it looks like you want to say something on that, but can you just talk a bit about that?
Yeah, Jonathan makes some good points. I think there's a few interesting points there. Yeah, like there is a tendency to want shiny and a great MOA video or website or exhibition booth or whatever. And I think that one of the key things that kind of led us down the UX route is, culturally, we don't really fit into an advertising agency space. We don't really fit into a kind of traditional medical education agency space, but we really think about marketing and the goals of everybody. And so really what a really valuable asset is going to do is not just going to look great and be attractive. It's going to help people achieve their goals. And this is a thing that often gets forgotten. And I think that one of the huge barriers is culture, especially in pharma and biotech. You've got a culture where the marketing strategy is built around a molecule which has differentiators. A lot of money is spent on what is the unique thing about this molecule, and then what is the evidence that it does something better or slightly different to another molecule. And so the marketing is based on how can we convince everybody that these things that we want to say are true, and that's it. And so the marketing budget is spent on getting those messages that the pharma company or biotech has developed themselves to as many people as possible, and then fingers crossed they believe it and they start using the product, and that's where most of the money is spent. Whereas what we would look at is more evidence-based and say, okay, well, if your goal right now is to attract doctors to speak to you about your product, then they don't care about the product at this point. Like, the first thing you've got to do is find out what are their current challenges, what are their current passions, can I add value for them in return for permissions to speak to them, and attract them. And so you have the mentality that your goal at stage one of turning someone from a target into an engaged user is nothing to do with your product messaging at all. So don't shoehorn that into everything that you do. Focus on just getting that permission. That's step one. That's the goal. And so when we build a website, which part of that website is designed to get permissions to contact? That part of that website is not going to have anything to do with the product on it. So you really got to break things down into what are the goals here, like what is the expected tangible actions that you want someone to perform, and then focus on that. So I think that's a huge barrier, because it's not how product owners, product managers think at the moment. And so you got to convince them of that. What is quite easy though is once you get into a situation where you can explain that process and somebody's interested in listening to it, it makes a lot of sense. And once you start showing people, and people in med ed agencies will get this, because they will say, you know, if we start to talk about our brand and we have a promotional meeting, we'll have 10 people show up. If we have a medical education meeting, the content's great, we'll have 100 people show up. That's because the educational meeting is focused on the user's goals, so more people will show up. So you got to think about what the goal is. And so that's one challenge to overcome, I think. And the second thing is something that Tom talks about a lot and is really hard to integrate, is that research at the forefront, because it takes time and it can be expensive. And, you know, companies have often already spent all their money on market research, but it's not fit for purpose. They've had a focus group. They haven't really, they're KOLs maybe. They're not actual practicing doctors who are going to use the product or service. And so they haven't quite got it right. They haven't. So if you can use your assets to prove to people, hey, you know, here's your website now. If we do a review of that, there's some quick wins, integrate those quick wins and see how the conversion changes, then they believe it, then you can overcome that challenge. So that's kind of it. That's what I feel are the big barriers to this at the moment. Personally, Tom, I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, you know, as someone that's done UX for quite a while, it's definitely quite a, it feels like a unique challenge to people that do UX, is that we have to constantly try and you know, get buy-in for what we do, and you know, what our process is. And I think one of the most important things to do is kind of demystify it. And to do that, one of the things that I like to do is I just like to get people involved in what I'm doing. So that's not to say like, can you help me do the work? It's more, so an example of this is I was doing some observational user testing once. So, you know, this is where I was doing it for I was trying to find usability problems of a website. So what I would do is I'd have people come in and I would sit them down with their own computer, with the website, and I would just set them tasks to do. So can you go find this piece of information? Can you go fill in this form, kind of thing? But what I did is I was doing that in one room, and then in another room, I had the actual client whose website it was, watching the recording of us doing the test and taking notes. And that changed everything for them, because they were able to actually, you know, be part of the process and see what people were saying about their website. And, you know, you'd actually get people scrolling up and down a website trying to find a button, and the client would be in the next room going, it's there, but it's like, well, actually, you know, I've done this with 10 people now, and none of those 10 people have been able to find that button. So obviously there is a problem. But actually getting them involved in that process, and, you know, getting them, you know, to see what was really going on behind the kind of curtain, I think, you know, that sold the process to them. And I ended up doing loads of UX work with that company. So, you know, I think a big part of kind of getting buy-in with UX is definitely kind of demystifying it. I always try and force myself to use as little jargon as possible, and also just getting people across the actual process and getting them involved.
I can actually add, like, I think, Tom, we can talk about, without talking about the company and stuff in detail, like one of the first projects that we really integrated the UX process in was we would develop, like in a much more detailed way. We've been developing it was a big project for a pharma company that we worked with, who wanted to create a, you know, like an educational hub or zone for I mean, this is the classic project. I mean, a lot of people always propose this kind of thing, but the idea would be that people would find this genuinely useful, would have like videos, podcasts, all that kind of stuff on it. Probably sounds familiar to a lot of people. But, you know, this was working with multiple different brand teams across the company in different portfolio areas. So it had a broad, quite a broad scope with lots of stakeholders. And the real challenge was that was trying to align all of the different brand goals to be the same, and then to also actually think about the end user and how they will experience the website itself. And so you really need to get to a point, because this is going to be an expensive job, a lot of content development, loads of writers involved, loads of production development involved, loads of approvals, a lot of time for the clients to approve everything, like a big deal. And so you need to get to a point where everyone goes, I understand what this is going to be once you start this. Because typically in these kind of projects, you'll see, if you work at agencies and stuff, or in one of these teams, you'll see that, you know, you're supposed to do this in 6 months, a year goes by, potentially 2 years, nothing gets launched because no one ever approves it, because the goalposts keep changing, or, you know, something doesn't work. And so you need to get to a point where you can create something that people can see and understand that isn't the site. It isn't designed, there's no content on it, but you can understand how a user will interact with it and what value it will add. And so we had a clear UX scope there. And Tom, I don't know if maybe you can just give an insight into, because I think it would be useful to everyone, like how the client felt about, so when you develop like the full wireframes for that, you know, the site I'm talking about, right? For that structure, like what do you think that the client found valuable about it, and what was the reaction that you got from doing that?
Yeah, I think that there was, so on one level, there was certain kind of problems that the design had, the design that I was kind of given at the start, that just no one really knew how to solve them. So one was, you know, being able to kind of unpack those problems and solve them from, you know, from using someone that's got UX experience was very helpful for the client. But also, I think, you know, when I was presenting my wireframes back to the client, and, you know, it was like a 2-hour meeting, and they would just constantly ask me questions. Oh, what do you think about this? What do you like? What would happen if we moved that there? And it was more, you know, that one of the things that I love about my job is solving problems kind of like on the go and within like a conversation. And I think they found it really helpful to have someone that they could talk to that was able to, one, explain what the solution was, but also be able to help them solve problems with that solution. So yeah, I think that was the big thing on that project.
Can I just ask, Sunil's asked about the sort of time, he said how much time average would you allow for a UX research before starting a digital piece, which is probably one of those impossible questions. But do you want to just sort of like say a few words to him about that? I guess the bottom line is just important to do as much research as you need in order to find out what you need to find out in order to deliver the right project. I'm being overly flippant there perhaps, but do you want to sort of say a few words to Sunil's question there?
Yeah, so yeah, yeah, it is quite difficult to be like, oh, 5 days, but obviously it depends on the size of the project. I'd also like to say that if it's a project that, you know, the more investment the project is, so the bigger the scale of the project, the more research you should do, because there's obviously a lot more to lose, there's a lot more risk there. But, you know, it is all about, you know, what I kind of put in my presentation, which is, one, understanding the user needs. So you do as much research as you can to understand those user needs. So you talk to people, do interviews, you know, do surveys, whatever you can do and whatever you can afford to do. Obviously, surveys are probably quite a lot cheaper than actually doing, one-on-one interviews. But one-on-one interviews are probably more valuable. And then again, looking at the business goals. So obviously, I speak from an agency side. I like to have conversations, just like 20-minute conversations with people from all different departments of that company that's going to be affected, so that I kind of understand where everyone's coming from. Because you shouldn't, it would be kind of pointless if you only spoke to one department or one person and you took everything they said for gospel. And then the other thing is, once you understand that and you start designing, then the most important thing you can do is the testing. So is actually try and get people, not testing, whoever else is working on the product, but testing, whether it's definitely people that will be using it, or actually, it could just be anyone, like I know it sounds silly, but I've designed a website before and I'll be like, oh, can I get my mum to be able to use it? And if she can use it, then that's a really good sign to me. And that's just like a cheap way to do it. But, just those three things: find out the user needs, find out the business goals, and then while you're designing and while you're building, be testing with people.
Yeah. And I do think, one of the funniest things you can be involved in, but the most frustrating things, and I can speak from experience here, is sitting there with somebody and you're showing them your website, or you're getting them to use your website, and it might not be a formal test, or it might be a formal test, but the frustration as someone is sitting there and they just can't see that big button, like you mentioned, that is perfectly obvious to you, and yet until you put your mum in front of it or something, it's different. And I've been on both sides of it, because I have sat there in front of other people's websites and gone, I don't know how to do this, and I've had somebody sitting there getting very frustrated with me. Again, it's sort of obvious, but it's amazing how many of us just don't worry about it, because it looks fine, it works fine. And I have been in a situation where we've developed something, launched something, and tested it, found out there's a problem, and being told, well, it's too late, we'll just have to live with it, because we haven't got the money to go back and reiterate and so on. And one of my learning points, again, very early on, was the testing is important, but you've got to build in the opportunity to take advantage of that testing. And if they're going to tell you that there's a problem, you can't go into a situation where the developer says, great, but in 6 months' time, I'll be able to get around to that. You've actually got to go, there's a problem, we need to fix it. And that's part of the process that people just sort of forget. I guess I'm stating the obvious, but to some extent, I think unless you go through that and think, you don't necessarily think about it. So you learn from your mistakes, I guess, is the.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer, Jonathan's question. He says there's, so an internal kind of beta or delta launch, which just to describe like the output, like there's two things to that. One is so at a campaign level with multiple assets, you can essentially create a map of like assets and touch points, and you can say there's a particular type of persona or user that you want to attract, and they are currently, a target. And so your goal is to get permissions to contact them. You can look at where their entrance points are and go along that map. And what Tom can do is look at what are their goals at each stage. And you can actually have then a list of assets, and what they're for, who they're designed for, and what they're designed to do. So if I'm a customer service or account manager or sales rep, which is a terrible term, but is what people's roles are, you can say, okay, well, I know what stage my customer is at in terms of confidence. I know I have these assets at my disposal. We know from the research that this type of user will prefer to interact in this space and at this time. I can contact them, send them that thing. Do they perform the action that I want them to perform as a result of that, whether that be attending a meeting or downloading something? If they do, it's successful. If they don't, it's maybe not successful. And if we keep reviewing that and it's never successful, we have to change something about that part of the journey. So it's kind of a wireframe for the whole thing, but then at the individual asset level, yeah, of course. So for a website, what Tom has the skills of is also kind of like a designer, also understands the business goals and the content architecture. And so what he can do is develop something that looks nice enough. It's like a skeleton and potentially a clickable model of what will happen. So you can actually demo exactly how things will work without spending a load of money on actually developing material, which is really valuable. So that's like the output that you can kind of expect. Honorarium rate, just a political answer, is
Okay, so what I was, So what I was going to say was, we've sort of run out of time. I think this is fascinating, and I just think there's, as usual, there's different directions we can go in with this. And I just always think the practical experience is important. So you've sort of got to make your mistakes. And it's not a problem to make some mistakes, so long as you can then react and do something about it. What frightens me are the people that either don't want to make mistakes and therefore spend all their time worrying about getting something perfect and never launching anything, or doing something, not thinking about it, doing it too quick, and then, as I say, just turning around and going, well, we can't do anything about this now. There's got to be a middle ground. So anyway, look, I think we've covered a lot of interesting ground that hopefully we've made people think a little bit. I do want to wrap the recording part of this up now. So can I just say a huge thank you to Dan and Tom for talking to us and hopefully giving us something to think about. I know I can talk for both of you and say you're very happy for people to contact you via LinkedIn is the easy way, or you've given your contact details at Brandcast and so on. So please, anyone watching this, please make contact. To those of you in the audience, thank you for joining in and some of the questions that have come in. I'm going to wrap this up as a recording now, but those of you who are listening to us, don't all run away if you don't have to, because we'll carry on to the top of the hour and pick off a couple more of these other questions and some general chat before we finish at the top of the hour. So everyone, I'm just going to stop the recording now, and so we just give a bit of a wave. I should just say, sorry, quick plug for me, if you're interested in what we're doing here and haven't been before, medcommsnetworking.com, you'll find details of everything coming up, and lots and lots of stuff that's going on, and resources and archives of materials. You'll find videos at NetworkPharma TV, for instance. There's more than 300 videos there now, so it's becoming quite a good content resource there, and so on and so forth. I'm always happy to help if I can. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Dan and Tom. Quick wave and we'll stop the recording. So thank you very much and bye.